can't wait to hear your comments on the roundtable discussion on LinkedIn. So don't forget to leave your comments, and we'll be checking you out. Now let's turn our attention to a conversation on the national scope. Please join me in welcoming Steve Berg, Chief Policy Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness in Washington, D.C., and Ralph Ortega, Editor-in-Chief of City and State, New York.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ralph Ortega. I'm the Editor-in-Chief at City and State. It's my pleasure to sit with Steve Berg here today. He's the Chief Policy Officer, specializing in employment, economic development, and human services, and the crossover between those issues and housing. Steve came to the Alliance from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he worked on state-level welfare reform and employment. Before coming to Washington, he spent 14 years as a legal services attorney in California and Connecticut, working on housing, government benefits, employment, and family integrity. His experience includes nonprofit management and staff training and development. Welcome, Steve.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. Thanks to everybody for having me here.
Steve, so to start our conversation, you know, homelessness rose to an all-time high in 2023. That included families and families with children. The question, just to give us some context, is, you know, please tell us how we got there, and if now that they just did the newest survey, if you have an idea or can give us what your expectations are of what the next head count will reveal.
Sure. So I think that there's short-term reasons and long-term reasons why we saw a big increase in homelessness nationwide this last point in time count, which was the count from January of 2022. I think the long-term reason is most prevalent. I mean, there were short-term reasons depending on what part of the country you were in. The end of the COVID era help that was available for eviction prevention, rising interest rates made it hard for people to develop new housing. The immigrant issue, which you've talked about here, a big thing in places like New York and Chicago, not so much a thing in other parts of the country, but in places where it hit, it was really a big part of it. But the long-term trend is the same, and it's the same as it's been for years and really decades, which is that the cost of a modest place to live goes up faster than wages in a modest job, or certainly goes up faster than disability benefits. So we're seeing, we had a period, I mean, to go back, we had a period in sort of the mid-zeros to the early teens where, you know, that same thing with housing getting more expensive was happening, but it was the development of homeless systems all over the country really working to move people who were homeless into housing faster, and that really reduced the number of people who were homeless for 10 years. But then at some point, moving people who are already homeless back into housing will only get you so far if every time you move somebody into housing, there's another person or two people that replace them and are knocking on the door of your shelter because they can't afford housing anymore. So I think the long-term issue of housing is going to be the solution to this problem once and for all.
I want to ask, have you seen, or can you point out any communities that are already starting to make gains on that housing?
Yeah, I mean, there's communities that are starting that have sort of recognized this and are trying to do more. You know, we can point to a few places, Chattanooga, Tennessee, if anybody's spent any time there, they're doing a good job. You know, but there's a lot of places, you know, New York, there's housing being developed, but it's not enough. It's just the scale isn't where it needs to be. And so our work, I think, is going to be over the next few years to figure out how can we envision a much bigger scale intervention to deal with the problem of affordable housing.
Can I ask you about New York? The city has argued that the Callahan consent decree shouldn't apply to the asylum seeker crisis. Do you see the city winning this argument and it having a ripple effect across the nation?
Well, it's hard to predict what a judge is going to do with a request like this. I mean, I think the original Callahan case was based on a provision in the state constitution about local government's obligation to care for low-income people. The language of the state constitution doesn't make any distinction between by how long the person's been here, so I don't know, but I'm not going to try to predict that. I do know that all over the country, one of the responses to the rising homelessness is local officials trying to figure out a way where they won't be on the hook for this problem. And you know, I don't want to criticize anybody because they've got good reasons. It's perfect, like in New York, where so much of it is a result of decisions by the federal government on immigration. You know, where is the federal government with the money to deal with this problem? That's a perfectly fair question to be asking, and I think the more it gets asked, the better chance it'll go. I mean, right now, Congress is arguing over a big immigration bill. The issue has been very politicized in Washington, D.C. I don't know what's going to happen with that bill, but at least there's people there like really pushing for, you know, getting more federal resources on the table to deal with this.
Has the pressure increased enough, at least on the Biden administration, to get them to provide the support that, for example, New York has been asking for prior to Election Day?
Yeah, is it enough? I don't know. I mean, so far has it been enough? No, not yet. Although, you know, I'm sitting here checking my phone to try and figure out what's going on with these negotiations. They're literally right now in various rooms in D.C. Talking about what they can do, and I think funding for local governments who are dealing with this is definitely on the table. It's unfortunate that the issue has become very politicized, and that makes it harder.
How do you see the influx of migrants in New York City impacting future policy on homelessness, both, well, if you could speak to locally, but on a national level?
Yeah, I think on the national level, certainly, you know, part of the homelessness problem is various kinds of government policies that the result of which is that people end up living on the streets. You see that in the corrections field, you see it in the child welfare system, you see it in the mental health systems in states around the country. And I think the migrant situation is one more example of that. And I think it's just another example of how the government entities whose policies are causing these problems have to help out with the results. So in every one of those areas I mentioned, the people who make the policy related to child welfare or that relate to mental illness, they're just not thinking very much about housing. And they need to start, and we need to push them as hard as we can to do that.
Do you have any particular policy changes that you would like to see happen?
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, part of the issue is just money. You know, housing is expensive, and we have a system where it's sort of a private commodity that people pay for, and so people who don't have the money to pay for it are going to be left out. So there has to be money. I mean, the voucher program keeps coming up. That's a pretty decent program, by the way, as federal programs go. The problem with it is that, you know, it relies on the market to provide the housing that then the vouchers will pay for, and that is an iffy proposition sometimes. So there needs to be additional money on the table for help with development, and then a lot of work to make supportive services available. You know, the Medicaid program on paper pays for a lot of the health-related services that some of the hardest cases of homelessness need, but then when it comes to actually trying to use that, it's very difficult. So a lot of work needs to be done to help different agencies coordinate with each other, work better together, understand what problems each other is dealing with, and really hold everybody accountable for getting results.
Here's a different question for you. What are the possibilities with such a shortage of housing right now that we'll see the emergence of more of these sort of legal homeless camps?
Yeah,
or tent.
I mean, I think the possibility that it happens is very high. I mean, we're seeing more of them every day. It's not a good solution. I mean, some communities have, you know, sort of set up camps, designated camping areas, services are available there, and that's, you know, that's doing the best you can with the bad situation, but this is not a solution to anything, and I think the public really sees that. I think that will illustrate more and more the way that the rising unsheltered homelessness during the COVID era woke people up to the existence of homelessness in their communities in a lot of places where people hadn't really thought, because the homeless people were all in shelters, and so nobody knew that there were so many homeless people in, you know, in many cities around the country. But then once COVID hit and the shelters couldn't keep as many people there, it became much more apparent. So hopefully the public will be pushing for this. I think survey research indicates that the public understands that housing is the solution to this problem. What we have to do is we have to get political leaders on board to think both immediately but also in the long run of taking upon themselves the responsibility to make sure that this basic human need is provided to people in the United States of America. That's going to take a lot of work by elected officials, and we need them to do the work.
Again, slightly different question. So with the migrant influx, and it's not just been in New York, there's been a lot of pushback in the surrounding communities where people don't want sheltering of the asylum seekers who have been bused and transported from the southern border. Have you seen nationally any communities where they've been persuasive with the NIMBYs, let's say, to allow this sort of sheltering or to allow more permanent sheltering? In other words, is anyone making progress in convincing those who are opposed to seeing this sort of sheltering in their community, where they come to and accept it and allow it?
Yeah, well, and so this problem of, like, not in my backyard is not new, and it's not this is not the first time we've seen it. We've seen it all over the country with people who are homeless, with people who are immigrants, with people who were, you know, back in the day when a lot of states were shutting down their large custodial mental health facilities. We definitely saw it with that. And I think, you know, the answer is the same for all of those. You're not going to convince everybody. There will be people who, like, are dead set against this. But you need to, but most people in the United States, I believe, most people are good people who understand that people have problems and issues and things that they're struggling with, and that it's appropriate for the government to help with those things. And if political leaders have the courage to say, well, I'm gonna focus on those people who I know agree that this is the right thing to do, and the NIMBYs they'll be mad at me, but they'll just be mad at me. I mean, I think, that I wish there was some easier way to tell elected officials that they can escape this problem, but there isn't. I mean, I think a good example is the mayor of Washington, D.C. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, and we, for a long time, had one big family shelter in Washington, D.C., which was a terrible place to stay. The whole setup was just a disaster. And then some very bad things happened that got a lot of publicity. And the mayor just said, we're going to close that shelter. We're going to put up humane scaled shelters in every ward in the city. So every member of the city council is going to have a family shelter in their ward. And these are going to be good places for people to live. And they're going to be humane. And we're just going to do it. And yeah, there was plenty of pushback for that, but the mayor just said, no, we're going to do this. This is the right thing to do. She was very vocal about it. And now we've got this much better family shelter system in Washington, D.C., that really are good places for people to come. They put a lot of rapid rehousing resources on the table at the same time they did this, so the new shelters aren't even full. There's a big reduction in family homelessness in Washington, D.C., because the politicians just said, this is the right thing to do, and we're going to do it.
How did they pay for it? What kind of funding did they rely on?
I think they found that they were already paying quite a bit of money for badly sheltering homeless families. So I think they took some of that money and used that. They used various sort of federal funds as families as kids, so they used TANF funding to help with the rapid rehousing part. TANF funding is a great source of funding for rapid rehousing for families. And they just patched it together.
So is there a number, or can you sort of give us a sense for what kind of level of funding that the federal government needs to provide, perhaps for all these cities that are struggling right now?
Yeah. So, what I generally say about this is, if you really wanted to end homelessness and really focused on Upstream and got the vouchers on the table that you need, and you'd need about $100 billion more a year in federal funding for the various programs to do that, which sounds a lot if you're used to dealing with a local budget, even New York City's local budget. But it's, the federal spending is $6 trillion a year. So $100 billion offset by the various kinds of savings that are well documented and proven over and over by 1 million studies you would get if you did that. That's probably what we're looking at.
You said $100 billion.
$100 billion a year, yeah.
Okay.
Well, compared to 6 trillion. Think of 6
yes,
trillion. Yeah.
Yes. Well, that kind of puts $100 billion
Right.
in a more, get my arms around it. So, the migrant crisis has really put the issue of homelessness on, hopefully, the radar screen of more Americans than previously, before the crisis began. Can you talk a little bit about the impact it's had outside of New York City?
Yeah, I think so. It's interesting that we've talked to a lot of communities about how their homeless shelters are dealing with the migrant crisis. And some places just, what migrant crisis? They just haven't seen it. Some of the places we've heard that from are places where, for years, forever, their homeless system has been dealing with immigrants some of whom are undocumented, some of them not. But then there's other places where, yeah, it's a big issue in Chicago. It's a big issue in Minneapolis. And sort of by weird contrast, there's a big issue in Portland, Maine, which is a much smaller city than those other places, but it's a place where they had a small migrant community, and a lot of people have now come there because they knew people or their friends knew people who were there, and so they're dealing with, you know, a family shelter system, which over the years they had adopted very good housing first policies in Portland and really whittled down the number of homeless families. And now all of a sudden their family shelter system is full to overwhelmed again with migrant families. So it's happening all over the country.
Since you said some are well accustomed to receiving migrants, have you noticed any novel or innovative systems for bringing them in and providing them services, and maybe a few lessons that New York City can learn from?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the kinds of things people have been talking about here. I mean, you have to, it's like any other homeless population, you have to have some way of outreach that people are going to be able to connect to. You know, a lot of places around the country are sort of have figured out a long time ago that if they use people with lived experience of homelessness to do outreach work to people who are homeless, that's an effective strategy. I think the same thing with migrants. It really, because it is people, I think in a city like New York, the impression I'm getting, it is people from all over the world. So, you know, I learned a long time ago that one of the things about working on homelessness, you end up having to be an expert in a lot of things you never thought you'd have to be an expert in, and one of those is sort of the state of world politics, like what is going on in Venezuela, what is going on in Peru right now, what is going on in various parts of Africa where people are showing up, or you know, Ukraine is in the press a lot, but there's places in the US where suddenly they're finding a lot of Ukrainian refugees, again, with no place to live and no sort of funding source from the federal government. So, you know, like with a lot of things, the homeless system end up, you know, here, you handle this, and we do handle it in a very effective way, but it's not a real viable solution. Because I think this problem is going to get worse too. I mean, if you start looking at the things that are happening around the world in the countries where a lot of migrants are coming from, you know, a lot of it is there's climate change issues, resources depleted, and then if you start, like another thing you have to learn about if you're doing homeless policy, if you look at those things, you ask, are there solutions to those coming down the pike? Not right away. So it's going to keep happening. So we need to insist that it be addressed in a way that's not just leaving us sort of scrambling around without enough money.
Thank you, Steve. We've got a little less than 10 minutes left for this moment with this interview with Steve, and I'd like to ask the audience if they have any questions to ask. Just feel free to raise your hand, and we'll get you a microphone. We'll get you.
It's kind of a question and a statement combined. My grandmother came over here from Barbados, 14 years old, on a boat. I don't know if her grandbaby could do that. She married my grandfather, elevator operator, then worked for the trains. They were able to eventually get an apartment and save money in the bank. I don't see that happening nowadays. It's hurtful to me when I hear somebody say that migrants are going to destroy this country. But one of the problems is a born and raised Harlemite that I see and I hear all the time, and I see with people sleeping on the trains all the time lately, much more than I ever saw before, is how do you explain to New Yorkers how they can't find housing and migrants are coming over and getting housing? Now, I can tell you that many stories and things that I have seen in some of this housing that has been provided. I mean, they have officers in there guarding people who are also in shelters themselves. The shelters are poorly run. All kinds of things happen, people getting raped, attacked, etc. I don't know if there needs to be more involvement by our politicians, who I feel receive big money from realtors to help maintain these rents that are pushing their own communities out. So, you know, I'm looking at this problem and I see my community suffering and complaining about the migrants who I feel are being used as scapegoats for other situations and problems which really kind of come back on us because we're electing these people. And we're allowing them to get money from realtors to put 20% housing on free land that they get for the community. So I just want to throw that out to everybody because I think we need a reality check as a community as to what we are doing and who we are electing. And we can scream and yell all we want, but until we put people in who care about the community they're supposed to represent, things are not going to change. And I just want to throw that out there and see how other people feel about that.
Thank you. Over in the middle. In the middle. Thank you. Meet you halfway.
How you doing? Freddie Matthews, Senior Vice President of the Garcia Network. You had mentioned earlier how heavy homelessness is politicized and what a factor it plays. You know, we struggle, of course, with different states. I kind of have a two-part question. Have you seen any partnerships across the nation between states who are collaborating with each other to support each other in this process? And then the second part of that is, you know, initially a lot of it started with, you know, Republican states trying to send to Democratic states for, because of the beliefs in immigration. Have you seen any bipartisan partnerships across states to assist with the migrant crisis?
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of partnerships between different cities. I think a lot of people at the state level are sort of new to the idea that homelessness is their job at the state level. But we also very much think it is their job at the state level. I mean, as we're dealing with people who have different kinds of health issues, most of the healthcare systems are run by the states or run by sort of the states delegating to the counties, whereas the housing is usually considered more of a mayor city government thing. So trying to get those people working together that can be challenging, but it's gotta happen. And I think we're starting to see a couple of places where that's happening. I think in the state of Minnesota is an example where they're doing a lot of that. Some of the small states in the upper Midwest, I mean, South Dakota is doing things like that. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence. These are some of the smaller states because it's sort of the volume of and how far people need to bring themselves together is a little easier in a smaller place. But there are definitely places that are starting to really work on that.
Hi. I was a little bit late, so I'm sorry if I missed any discussion about substance use, but I imagine, or at least the clients that I've worked with who are choosing to be street homeless or the encampments that are around are usually related to people who are using drugs. And so I'm wondering if there's any policy in New York that's in works to make the regulations on housing a little bit more flexible for people who do use drugs. I know there's some safe haven housing options that allow drug use in the buildings, but I think safer drug use should be allowed inside certain buildings. And I don't know if there's any policy on that.
I mean, there's definitely people who understand that, like I'm working mostly with policymakers at the federal level, and there's definitely people who understand that. That is like right at the center of when I talk about partisan conflict on this issue. That's right at the center of that. I don't know if the people who are sort of opposing sort of that kind of housing first, harm reduction kinds of policies, if they really care about what the most effective way to deal with substance use treatment is, or whether it's just they feel like it's an issue they can sort of get the public on their side on. But it's definitely a problem. I mean, the people who, the policymakers who understand about homelessness and understand about substance use disorder completely agree with what you said. I mean, people look at the research and it's absolutely clear. But that's where we're getting some of the partisan conflict. And I think the more it moves from being sort of homelessness to being about substance abuse, the more that's going to be the case. And we just need to keep making the case for what we know works.
I think we have time for one more.
I'm going to be nice today.
Thank you.
This is Shams the Baron, also known as the homeless hero, now known as the housing hero. I just wanted to commend y'all and everybody here. It's very good discussion. I'm learning a lot. Ralph, Steve. If there was a question, perhaps sort of like a call to action for people like myself and I guess others, what are the things that can be done on the federal, state, and particularly New York City level to help alleviate the issue of housing and homelessness and also our migrant crisis?
So, like I said, I work mostly at the federal level, and I would say it's just talking to those representatives over and over and over and over again. I mean, just getting to know them, getting to know their staff, invite their staff to come and see your programs. It doesn't matter if they're liberal Democrats or conservative Republicans. If it's about money, then it's an issue of priority. So somebody can be very supportive of your program if they're in Congress, but when the time comes that they have to make a choice between more money for housing and more money for some other thing that needs a lot more money, but that is more their priority, they're going to do that. So you need to keep pointing out to these elected officials the importance of this, just on an ongoing basis and in every way you can think of doing.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. And we're going to move on to our next panel.